In this video, I'm going to explain how and why I use a spot meter for my film photography. Now, I've used a spot meter for probably the past 15 years for just about all my film photography. Sometimes I use the camera's inbuilt meter, but predominantly I use one of these devices because it gives me a very accurate reading and it gets my exposure spot on. It's fair to say that you don't need a spot meter to do film photography, but one of the great advantages is if you shoot with multiple different cameras and you use one of these devices, then you can rule out inaccuracies with your inbuilt camera's meter. Some cameras will meter differently to others. Some cameras may have very crude metering, some have sophisticated metering. But if you use an external meter like this, you can develop your technique and get it pretty accurate across all the different cameras you use. So let's start with a brief look at the actual spot meter. Now, mine is a very old Sekonic L508, about 20 or so years old. It's the second one. And I've used this model exclusively for all my spot metering. I know how it works. I'm quite happy with it. Now, the spot meter consists of a few basic controls. You set the speed of the film on a little dial here. So you can set the ASA or the the exposure index, whatever you're shooting at. So I can go for say a 400 speed film. There we go, for my HB5 Plus. And when I do my metering, it will register the speeds for that particular film. Now, once you've set that into the meter, you're good to go all day. Now, the only other control I use is the exposure button. I look through the meter at the scene I want to shoot and I press the exposure button. It's as simple as that. But what makes a spot meter so different from potentially the meter in your camera? Maybe it's a digital SLR, or maybe it's a very old manual film camera with some rudimentary center weighted metering. Well, the spot meter, as the name suggests, takes a very, very narrow angle of view onto your scene. Now, on my spot meter, I can adjust from between 4 degrees, which is quite wide, and 1 degree. Now, I've never used anything other than 1 degree, and an awful lot of spot meters out there only have 1 degree on them. Now, I find that gives me a very, very small dot which I can measure against the luminance values in the scene. Now, the spot meter allows you to get very close to those little bits of the scene which may be very bright or very dark. And with a normal camera meter, you just couldn't get to those. If it's a distant scene and there's some very dark areas in mountains, maybe the angle of view is just too narrow for your normal camera meter to get to. So you're going to have to take a sort of educated guess or rely on the overall metering. With a spot meter, I can take very, very precise readings around the scene, the sky, the water, the shadows in the tree trunks potentially. And I know where the darkest and lightest areas are because I have such precision with a 1 degree. Now, you can attach a long lens to your normal camera and get that sort of close-up view if you want to, but it's a very clumsy way of doing it. This is a very lightweight device, runs on a couple of batteries and lasts about a year, so it's a very simple way of getting very accurate meter readings. Now, there are two basic types of film out there. There are negative films and there are positive films. I'll refer to positive films as slide films from now on because that is the general terminology used out there. Now, if you are shooting with a slide film, it will behave completely differently to a negative film. So your metering technique needs to be different. They're completely different mediums. It's not sufficient to meter a scene with a slide shot in mind and then transfer those settings automatically over to a film shot with negative material. So you have to think before you shoot, and there are different techniques you can apply with your spot meter to get the best out of both of those film types. Now, to simplify things greatly, let me just state here there are two rules I follow. For negative films, I get adequate detail in the shadow areas. The shadow areas are what drives my exposure. If I get the shadow areas right, I'm pretty much certain the exposure is going to be good enough. Now, with positive slide films, I must get the highlights right. If I lose those highlights and they clip in digital terms, they're gone. They're gone forever. So I must protect the highlights. So with negative films, I'm metering the shadows. With slide films, I'm metering the highlights. And let's look now an example of each of these types of films and show you how and where I metered to make sure I got the whole brightness range onto the final image. Now let's start with black and white film. This is what I predominantly shoot. It's the most common medium I use, and it's the area where you particularly see people talking about things like the zone system, etc. We have pure white, which is zone 10, and we have pure black, which is zone 0. Now in between there you have 9 usable zones. That's zone 1 right up through to 9. And what we try to do with the metering is make sure we get enough shadow detail. So I look for an area in the scene where there is plenty of rich shadow detail. It's sort of down towards the low end of the scene, you know, in the sort of darker areas, but there's plenty of detail in there. Now I will meter that area, and when I meter that area, I must make sure I get sufficient exposure to show those shadows. I don't want them going too black. So I will use my spot meter and I will read those shadow areas. Now once I've read those shadow areas, I can then set my exposure based on those shadows. And typically if I meet a shadow area at say at 1 second at f16, I will set my exposure then to be 1/4 of a second at f16, because that will put the shadows on what's known as a zone 3. A zone 3 is an area of rich shadow detail. Now let's work through an example here on the screen where I took a shot which encompassed a wide subject brightness range, but I really needed shadow details in the tree trunk. Now if you look here at the image, now what we have here is a set of tree trunks. Very, very bright day, it's morning, it's very, very sharp light. Now I metered around the inside of these tree trunks because I wanted these to have detail. If these were black, it would kill the image for me. So I carefully metered off these tree trunks and I checked the reading, and then I set my shutter speed 2 stops faster. Now that pushed these shadows, instead of being a mid-grey, because all meters, by the way, will try to make things a mid-grey, and it pushed those shadows down onto what's known as a zone 3. Now if I'd have just left the reading as it was without adjusting the camera, these would have been very light indeed, far too light, and they wouldn't have expressed the mood of the morning. And if you look down here in some of the other areas, there are very, very deep areas of almost solid black. Now they're down at the zone 2 and zone 1, where there is very little detail whatsoever. But I've also managed to retain detail in the highlights right up there at sort of zone 9. Maybe a couple of areas have gone pure white at zone 10. But the spot meter has allowed me to get that accurate reading hours after. You could have walked up in this situation with your normal camera and got close to this area in the shadow in the bark and got a reading. But if that subject was a long way away, like a mountain, or the tree trunk was out, over a cliff or something like that, you wouldn't be able to take an accurate reading. So with the spot meter, I was able to, get really close against this tree trunk from where I was standing with the camera and just pick it out. And also I could then move up and shoot the sky through the branches. Not something you could do with a normal camera meter. Now, colour negative. Now, colour negative I treat exactly the same as black and white. I'm going looking for those shadow areas with plenty of detail in them. I need to make sure that I get rich detail in the shadows on my colour negative images, otherwise they'll go to black and mush, and I just don't like that look whatsoever. So, and another example taken last year in a forest again. Now this is a good example where I couldn't actually walk much further into the scene because it was all boggy and marshy. Now if you look here at the image, I have a couple of tree trunks coming through the water, and there are lots of ferns in there. Now this shot really did rely on me getting plenty of detail into these shadow areas on the tree trunks themselves. I really had to get that shadow detail in there. If they were black, they would be a bit harsh for my liking, and I wasn't trying to convey that mood in this scene. So I metered very carefully with the spot meter along the bottom edges of these tree trunks, and I was able to determine my reading from there. Now the subject brightness range here was probably only about 3 or 4 stops, so I had no problem with the highlights. They weren't going to run away with me. But if I'd have just used a normal camera meter and taken an average reading for the scene, there's a good chance these shadows would have dropped below that sort of magical zone 3 and they would have lacked sufficient detail. The rest of the scene would have been absolutely fine. Yeah, all the greens and all the browns and all the other oranges in there would have been great. But if those shadows had dropped away, it would have killed the sort of light feel I was trying to get out of this shot. Now the final film type is colour slide, and I will admit straight away that this is the most tricky type of film to meter. I mean, just about everybody who's shot colour slide will have had those experiences where you've got them back and they've either been horrendously dark and blocked up with no shadow detail, or more likely you've got white skies with absolutely nothing in them, and nothing looks worse. It's like clipping in digital, but the dynamic range is tiny. Now with slide film, you may be looking at 4 or 5 stops maximum. Velvia, 4 stops. Provia, probably about 5 stops. So you have to take a different approach with your metering here. And what I typically do is I will use my spot meter to meter around the scene. Now I will be looking not only for the darkest areas of the image, but I'll be looking for the highlights as well. Now I want to get the whole subject brightness range usually in one shot. Now if I go above 5 stops, I may well switch to a negative film like Hectare or Portra 400. The other way is if your skies particularly are too bright, you can drop a graduated filter in there to bring them down. So it's very important to know where the brightest elements of the scene are and where the darkest parts are. Now looking at this example here I shot in the Lake District probably a couple of years ago, I had a brightness range of just over 5 stops, so it was pushing slide film. And I took one with Hectare, but this one came out particularly nicely on slide film. And the reason is I had my trusty spot meter. Now I initially metered for the darker areas of the scene around the tree trunk on the left and also in the reflections in the water. So I looked at those and thought that's about as dark as I want things to go. I don't want the tree trunks to go black, but equally I don't want to have the exposure of the highlights clipped to white. So I metered around the scene and I found the exposure for the tree trunks, and then I went around the scene and I spotted a couple of very bright areas. One was over on the far bank in some grasses and the other was on some minor tree trunks just behind the main one. Now in the final image, those tree trunks in the distance, those thin ones, I've just clipped to white, but they're a very, very small part of the image. So I don't mind that happening. It's relatively insignificant, but it was my spot meter that told me they were just outside the subject brightness range, so I may lose them. But had I compensated to get them just inside the right range by bringing my exposure in that direction to bias it towards those highlights, the tree trunk would have gone too dark. Now the tree trunk to me is a more important element. If that was black, that would kill the image. So I biased my exposure for the tree trunk. But it's all thanks to having the spot meter that I could take those very accurate readings. I mean, if you look at the distant small white tree trunk, it's tiny, very tiny in the frame. I could not have measured that any other way than with the trusty spot meter. So very good reason for carrying one of these devices. Now that was a very brief canter through my spot metering technique, and apologies if some of it may come across a little bit obtuse, but it's something I would like potentially to cover in more detail in a future video, just looking at one particular film stock on one particular shoot. So thank you very much for coming along, and I'll see you soon.